Keeping safety front of mind is all about communication. Welcome to the Farm Safety Roundup, a podcast series focused on important conversations to help keep farmers, their families, and their workers safe. Farm Safety Roundup is brought to you by the agricultural team at Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. With today's timely topic, I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Let's get to it. This season on the Farm Safety Roundup, we've looked at the hazards associated with many of the tools of the trade farmers utilize to get the job done. And we've talked about the controls needed to address those hazards to keep farm workers safe. Today's focus is on another necessity for farm operators, and we're talking about chemicals. Now, where there are chemicals, there are multiple concerns, from transportation and storage to handling and exposure to potential spills and disposal. Today's guest is Nicole Sherman. She's a health and safety consultant with Workplace Safety and Prevention Services, here to share some guidance on this very, very important topic. From maintenance to crop protection, chemicals in the farm can be dangerous. We used to look for a skull and crossbones on labels, but honestly, chemical identification has come a long way. Nicole, what are some of the main types of chemicals to be aware of?
Yeah, on farms, the exposure to chemicals happens all year round, and it, maybe depends on the season we're in or the commodity that is being farmed, but a lot of the types of chemicals that we see, number one is fuels, right? Certain gas, diesel, maybe mixed fuels or propane. Pesticides are a big one, such as herbicides, fungicides, and insecticides. Fertilizers, anhydrous ammonia, right? That's a really dangerous one. And I think of many examples where, farmers have went to check the tank, and unfortunately, you think you can hold your breath or, check it and look, and all of a sudden that waft of chemical comes out into the air, and that's a nasty one. And a lot of farmers have lost their lives as a result of exposure to that. Also, I think a lot of farms have their own machine shops on site. We're doing our own repairs, right? We're mechanics when it comes down to it as well sometimes. So lots of solvents, lubricants, maybe even some welding happening. So maybe gas under pressure like acetylene. So there's lots of different chemicals that we're exposed to as far as the synthetic side. There's natural and organic chemicals too. We won't talk about those today, such as the silo gas and manure gas or grain dust. A colleague of mine, Dean Anderson, did an excellent podcast with you back on hazardous atmospheres. And, there was a great discussion about those then. So those are what I think are some of the real common ones that we'd see on farms.
Yeah, I think a lot of the audience is very familiar with a lot of those being on their farms, so there is stuff to be aware of here. So how do these chemicals enter the body, and once they do, what type of symptoms should a farm worker look out for, and absolutely not ignore and just brush off?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so important to know, what it is that we're dealing with. And I'll talk about it probably a couple times through our conversation about, knowing the safety data sheet. But certainly, what form is that chemical coming in? Is it a solid? Is it a liquid or a gas? And, depending on that state, how does it enter the body? So are we inhaling it? So that is, there's powder in the air, or there's mist or vapors in the air, and we're breathing that in. That's the number one way chemicals enter into the body, or potentially absorption through the skin, depending on the chemical. Maybe we've ingested it. And I don't think we're obviously intentionally trying to ingest chemicals by any means, but in a way we have our coffee mug or our water bottle sitting out on the workbench or a certain area of the barn, and chemicals maybe are in the air, and as they fall down, they filter onto our cups and drinking containers and such. And then we inevitably then ingest that chemical. So it's so important to be cognizant of that. And the other way too is ingestion. So if we get poked with something, or pressurized liquids in lines and things like that, that's a way for them to enter the body as well. You're so right in that and I think farmers are very resilient. We are under pressure, we are under stress, and we need to get the job done. It's so important not to ignore what our body is telling us, that maybe something has gone wrong. So things like respiratory symptoms, like shortness of breath, coughing, irritations in the nose and throat, headaches, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, dizziness. There can be other things too, such as, feeling those rashes or irritations on the skin or chemical burns. And for some of us, it can have such dire effects, detrimental effects, such as death in seconds and minutes. And we may be even unaware of the hazard. So don't ignore those symptoms. If you start to feel them, get out of the area, get to fresh air, get to a well-ventilated area and kind of reevaluate the situation. What are the next steps? Do I need care? And if you are experiencing these symptoms, it's probably a sign that we probably don't have the right controls in place. So we need to reevaluate and think, what should we be doing better going forward?
So how can farmers stay safe when handling some of these chemicals? Because they are going to be on the farm. They're a part of daily life. So how do we protect ourselves?
Yeah, such a good question, right? We can't avoid the interaction with humans and chemicals. It's just how do we keep ourselves safe? And the one big thing that we always like to promote is the whole idea of stop, think, and act. So, you want to recognize am I being exposed to? What tasks am I going to be doing today? Assess what is that work? Am I doing maintenance and repair? Am I applying pesticides or anhydrous today? Am I refueling equipment? So do I have the right equipment? Is it in good working order? That's big. And do I have the proper PPE, which my safety data sheet will drive that as to what I need to be wearing, whether it's gloves or, chemical splash goggles or face visor or aprons and things like that. Do I maybe need a second person? Right? If this is a pretty hazardous chemical that I'm working with, should someone else be nearby? And am I prepared in case of an emergency? So, even thinking, am I in the right state of mind, both, physically and mentally as well, before I get into this task?
Nicole, what safety controls should be considered? And are there some that should be considered better or more of a priority than some of the others?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely have controls that are better than others. I will say this, we do know that farms fall under the Occupational Health and Safety Act. And a lot of times they fall to the, taking every precaution reasonable in the circumstances for the protection of our workers. There is also a general duty to make sure that, employers are providing information, instruction, and supervision to protect those workers and their health and safety. Chemicals has a lot of, heavy legislation. And while we know farms don't necessarily have many regulations that apply to them, there is, legislation under the Act with specific reference to toxic substances. So employers need to make sure that, where workers are exposed to toxic substances, that they are controlled. Toxic substances in the workplace need to be clearly identified, which means we need to be doing some proper labeling. And also workers receive enough information to be able to handle them safely, which means we need to have the training. So as we look at that and how this applies to what we like to call a hierarchy of controls, there are controls that certainly are better than others. When we look to, doing our due diligence, are we able to eliminate that chemical or that process? We always start there, and if we can't eliminate it, that's okay. Let's move down that hierarchy to the next best option, which may be substitution. So can we substitute out the more harmful chemical for one that's less hazardous? Or maybe this chemical comes in pellet and powder form. Your pellet form may be the best option, as the powder may become more aerosolized. The other option too, then, as we work down the hierarchy, is engineering. So a lot of times we talk about ventilation, and are we either able to be outside as far as that goes, or maybe do we need mechanical ventilation that pulls that dirty air away from our breathing space? And then we look at awareness. And awareness, I will kind of drive back to the point of where, while the WHMIS Regulation 860 does not fall under farms, it is a very good best practice to be following to do our due diligence, which just means we need to be providing our workers education and training. Do they know those pictograms, right? Do they know the core information on a safety data sheet, which is how can this chemical harm me? How do I protect myself? What PPE do I need to wear? And if there's an emergency, what's my next steps? So it's not getting into the whole chemistry of the chemical, but just what do I need to know from that information to keep me safe? In those cases too, there may be signage and things that could warn us of, chemical storage and things like that. If we look at our administrative controls, it's great to have an inventory of your chemicals on the farm. Okay. So what do I have on the farm? Do I have a safety data sheet? Is it available and accessible to all my workers? Am I properly labeling? Supplier labels may come in. If I'm decanting into another container, then, ensuring that I put a label on that container. And I will very much suggest right now that we're not using drinking containers, food containers, where I've got a little bit of, this spray left over and I'm going to put it in this peanut butter jar, right? We have had so many awful situations where colored liquids, clear liquids are going into water bottles, drinking containers, like different hydration drinking containers, and people are drinking those, and it's quite devastating as to what happens. And then
that's
PPE.
nasty. Ooh.
Yeah, for sure. And PPE is kind of our last line of defense. We can't get around it, but we have to kind of look at layering in those other controls. So gloves, respirators, potentially aprons, that eye and face protection, long sleeves, pants, those types of things as well. So
Nicole, when there's a lot of dangers on the farm, and when a danger is like a one-time occurrence, like say flood, we're on high alert, right? Or high wind. Like there's something that doesn't happen every day, but when we're around these kinds of products on a daily basis, we have to kind of fight human nature, which is being complacent.
Yeah,
right? And
absolutely.
Complacency just talk about that for a second as we wrap up.
It is important to make sure that we don't become complacent. We need to make sure that we use these chemicals on a regular basis. Are we prepared in case of an emergency, right? So do we know what chemicals we're using? What is our emergency response plan? Who has responsibilities within that? Even connecting with your local fire department, having them on site, knowing where your chemicals are stored, what you're using. Okay. Maybe do I need an emergency eye wash or shower on site based on the chemicals? Your safety data sheets will tell you that as well. Be prepared in case of that emergency. And I think that as well, just because we've done something in the past without issue does not make it safe. So just because the exposure to chemicals on farms is that regular occurrence, it doesn't mean that the harmful effects from those chemicals is something that should just be accepted, right, as part of the job. And we get one body and one life, and it is so important to make sure that we take care of it. And because if we don't, what's all this for at the end of the day? We want to be able to enjoy the fruits of our labor. When it comes to retiring, going on vacation, spending time with our loved ones and friends and family. We don't want to be experiencing chronic bronchitis, cancers, skin rashes and irritations that can last a lifetime as a result to exposure to these chemicals. So my main takeaway is to make sure that we're doing what is right and what is safe for you and all of your workers right now on your farm, and to ensure that we're in the moment protecting our health and safety now, because that really has a long-lasting effect on what our future could be as a result too. So
Nicole, thanks so much for joining us here today for the Farm Safety Roundup. Important topic, and really appreciate you shedding some light on it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
With agricultural expertise to help keep farmers, their families, and their workers safe, Farm Safety Roundup is a podcast series produced by Real Agriculture with the team of ag specialists at Workplace Safety and Prevention Services. Go to the website wsps.ca/farmsafety. There you're going to find free health and safety resources, and you'll also be able to check this episode's show notes for information on the topics discussed. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time to talk all things farm safety right here on the Farm Safety Roundup.